Hello. So today I will talk about extended context at the introduction of complex vocabulary in abridged literary texts. I understand that this could sound like a mouthful, so I'm going to break it down a little. Once again, maybe if you saw my presentation yesterday, it was also about abridged literature or texts that are composed specifically for reader audiences that have difficulty accessing the original texts. And this particular study was inspired by a question I received when I was being interviewed for my PhD, which is on abridged literature. It was whether it can happen for an abridged text to be actually longer than its original counterpart. And the short answer is yes. And this study looks at one particular case of when this might be necessary. It's a joint study with my research directors from Sorbonne University. So I will briefly introduce what an abridged text is, then talk about why longer context might be needed in this particular occasion of there being a complex vocabulary introduced. I will move on to presenting the research questions, the corpus, the pipeline for extracting the context in which complex words appear in the two sets of texts, abridged or unabridged. Then I will present the results based on the three research questions, and I will end with conclusions and future directions. So to abridge has a set of close synonyms such as to adapt and to summarize. And I have chosen to focus on the word abridge or abridgment because it is used specifically in literature, and also because it does not focus on a single dimension, such as a reduction of size, the way summarize does, but rather it feels like the focus is on it being a bridge or a means of making accessible something that was not accessible before to an audience of, let's say, children or foreign language learners or people with learning disabilities. And here's some official definitions of the term to abridge from the Cambridge Dictionary: to make a book, play, or piece of writing shorter by removing details and information that is not important. And similarly, in the Collins Dictionary, to reduce the length of a written work by condensing or rewriting. So the focus, sadly, is indeed on size, on length of text. But it is very easy to provide a counterexample. For instance, here is a parallel sentence in the full and abridged version of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And in the full text, we see the collocation solitary lighthouse, but in the abridged version, we see lighthouse built on a lonely rock, which is obviously longer. The research questions are as follows. Does complex vocabulary appear in a longer context or sentence within an abridged rather than full literary text more frequently than random vocabulary does? Then question 2, when present, can the lengthening of context in an abridged text be systematized with the help of relative linguistic theory and textual examples? And finally, can qualitative and quantitative differences of the phenomenon be observed in relation to different languages and different reader audiences? Moving on to a little bit of theoretical motivation behind why I am looking for longer context, in particular when it comes to the introduction of complex vocabulary. So linguistic theory talks about a process of fine-tuning. For instance, parents introduce new vocabulary to children by involving additional cues about the meaning and use. Here we can see the target word leopard. When we address a child, we might say something like, the spotted leopard is running like a cat. In this way, we provide additional information to the listener about what the leopard looks like, how it moves, and what it resembles. Also, there is evidence that within text, there is balance being sought, like a compromise between complexity in terms of vocabulary and in terms of grammar. And on the other hand, something on which, in particular, the linguist Harris really focuses is that simpler syntax is often associated with longer constructions, that language is often presented as contractions, and this is what causes complexity in it. And that if we were to go back to an original, fuller version of a statement that would contain the same amount of information, it would be easier to understand. The corpus consists of 8 famous literary texts. In particular, they are very popular among younger reader audiences, and they're often part of school curriculums, such as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, for instance. And the corpus consists of both full and abridged versions. The full versions might be up to 3 per book per language. And of course, if we're not talking about a translation, then there can be only one, the original version. But as I will mention, we also have translated texts. So in this case, there can be up to 3 full versions. And there are also up to 4 abridged versions per text. There is a total of 92 texts and 38.81 million characters. Also, some of the abridged texts are specifically indicated as being focused on a particular type of reader, such as children, foreign language learners, and people with learning difficulties. And there are 4 languages present in the corpus: English, French, Russian, and Spanish. When pairs are put together of original and abridged versions for every work and for every language, there is a total of 72 pairs. And I'm happy to say that my colleagues and I have made the corpus publicly available, so you can access it through this link or a link provided in the paper. Moving on to the context extraction pipeline that allows to compare the first contexts of appearance of a complex word in a pair of texts. First comes just traditional pre-processing. All the texts are brought to a plain text format. Meta text is removed, including prefaces and including those by the author. Then some easily definable mistakes, such as those caused by OCR, are removed. Then lemmatization is applied only for the Russian language as being strongly morphological, and part of speech tagging is performed on all texts in all languages. Then the lists of verbs and nouns that are common to each pair of texts, each abridged and unabridged pair, are extracted. Verbs and nouns as they carry the main meaning of text. And once these lists have been identified, they are compared against frequency lists for all languages that contain 5,000 words each. And we're left with just a list of the complex verbs and nouns that exist in a pair of works. And now we can juxtapose the sentences, the pair of sentences that is associated with the pair of texts, and we can see if the sentence is longer for the abridged version, in how many cases, and in what kinds of cases. An additional experiment is conducted in relation to research question 1, as I mentioned before, which is that this phenomenon of longer context in an abridged text occurs more often when it comes to complex rather than random vocabulary. So here, before filtering based on a list frequency list is conducted, random words are extracted from the list. And here come the results of research question 1, just mentioned. So 720 sentence pairs were sampled per scenario. So introduction of random versus complex vocabulary. And the abridged sentence was longer in 30.69% for the random words and 30.83% for the complex words. So even though the number is a little bit higher when it comes to complex vocabulary, the difference is too small for the null hypothesis to be rejected, unfortunately. And one possible explanation is that, in fact, when the instances of longer context in abridged versions were looked at in more detail, it was discovered that only in 28.83% of them we could honestly speak about extended context rather than other reasons behind the sentence being longer. And they could be based on things such as the choice of punctuation, or sometimes just the pair of sentences were so difficult from one another in terms of meaning and where they're placed within the text that comparison was not possible. Then the results of research question 2, which was whether if there are instances of the described phenomenon, they can be systematized. Yes, indeed, there are 3 types of additional context that have been easily identified. The first and most common one is additional vocabulary from the same lexical field, such as the leopard and the cat coming together, for instance. The second one was grammatical transformations. And the third one, actual definitions of the complex word involved. Here are some examples of the first type, additional vocabulary. Here is an extract from Oliver Twist. In the full version, we have roared, which is the target word here. And in the abridged version, we have roared with all the force of his baby lungs. So now we know in more detail how one roars. Then in Tom Sawyer, in French, the target word here is explorer, to explore. In the full version, nous devrions l'explorer encore. We should explore it further. And in the abridged, il découvre une grotte et pénètre à l'intérieur pour explorer les galeries. So here we have more information. They discover a cave and they enter inside it in order to explore the galleries. So we know in more detail that we have to go someplace in order to explore it. Then type 2, the grammatical transformations, very highly related to what Harris speaks of in terms of contractions and then extension of context. Here comes a set of parallel sentences from Romeo and Juliet in Spanish. In the full version, we have Ningún mendigo le pedía limosna. No beggar asked him for alms. Alms, limosna is the target word. And in the abridged version, we have a subjunctive. Ningún mendigo le suplicó que le diera una limosna. So even though the subjunctive is not necessary as the subject and object is one and the same in this sentence, it has been added in the abridged version. Alice in Wonderland in Russian, in the full version, we have tak revet, to howl like this, and in the abridged, revet v 3 ruchi, to howl like a stream, or literally like 3 streams. How in this way is actually extended to say how exactly. And then Romeo and Juliet in Spanish in the full version. courir, the verb to run in the first person singular in the past. And in the abridged, we also have the pronoun I, yo corrí, even though it is not necessary in Spanish due to the strong inflection of the verb. And finally, definitions, which might come in two types. They can be metatextual or outside of the text, like in the first case. This is from Les Misérables, the original French text. In the full version, we just have the word délabré or run down mentioned. And in the abridged one, we have a definition provided in the margin, délabré or mauvais état, run down in a bad state. And another example in French, where the phenomenon was most present, is from Romeo and Juliet. In the full version, we have Frère Jean, religieux du même ordre. And in the abridged version, c'est un religieux, un homme d'église. So here we have a definition of what a monk is, a monk, a man of the church. So this is a definition that just flows into the text, that is not provided separately. Here are the results of research question 3, namely whether one can perceive some differences in relation to the research phenomenon when it comes to different languages and different reader audiences. First of all, by language, we have the 4 examined languages. We can see that related vocabulary is most prevalent for English and French, and that although it is still very common for Spanish and Russian languages with stronger morphology, there is little difference between the prevalence of related vocabulary and grammatical transformation, even grammatical transformation tending to be a little bit higher. And finally, definition is the least used, as mentioned. Then by targeted audience, namely children and foreign language learners, unfortunately, people with learning difficulties were not included here, as there were no instances. It's very likely that the reason is that all texts of this category came from the Spanish language to start with, and the one and the same publisher. So we can see that for children, by far the most common means of extending the context in abridged versions is through providing related vocabulary. While for foreign language learners, the 3 methods come much closer together, which might be intuitive, as while children really learn from context, foreign language learners may sometimes resort to translations or explicit explanations of vocabulary item. And finally, conclusions and future directions. So as the first research question was not properly answered yet, the no hypothesis not being rejected, more research is required in order to determine the prevalence of the phenomenon. Then there is evidence that more morphologically strong languages might benefit more from grammatical transformations as compared to the other 2 types. Then foreign language learners, like we saw, might benefit from a higher variety of added contexts of the 3 types, rather than focusing on a single one, such as more vocabulary of the same lexical field. Some future directions would include including sub-audiences, such as when it comes to children, their age or grade level, and when it comes to foreign language learners, their proficiency level in the language. Unfortunately, as of now, the corpus is a little bit limited, so there are only a couple of instances per category, per phenomenon. And finally, this research focused on a very narrow phenomenon of there being extended context in the abridged version, somehow caused by the presence of complex vocabulary. But in fact, there is evidence that has shown through a verification of the examples that there may be other grammatical transformations that are broader in nature, that do not necessarily speak of Harisian extension of context, for instance, but that may speak of a change of verb tense to a simpler one, or removal of negation to leave a positive sentence. Here, length is not implied, but again, it speaks about differences caused by complex vocabulary. Okay, this is all. Thank you very much. And you're welcome to ask questions if you have any.